It started with a sealed conversation inside Sandringham House, one so sensitive that even longtime royal staff were abruptly dismissed from adjoining corridors. By sunrise, whispers were already spreading through Norfolk. Queen Elizabeth II's private cottage had not been left to Prince William, but quietly reserved for Prince George. The expression on William's face as trustees emerged from that meeting stunned even senior courtiers, because this was never supposed to happen publicly. And now, the monarchy's most carefully guarded inheritance plan was beginning to unravel. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, those inside the palace tried to dismiss the rumors as another wave of exaggerated royal speculation. That had become routine in recent years. One whisper emerged, aides denied it, the media moved on, and the institution survived another uncomfortable cycle, but this time felt different almost immediately. Staff members who had served Sandringham for decades reportedly noticed unusual movement around the estate long before the trustees formally arrived. Cars entered through primary gates usually reserved for emergency consultations. Senior legal advisors were quietly escorted through side entrances. Even longtime household employees were allegedly instructed not to discuss who was visiting or why. According to various interpretations circulating among palace administrative circles, the atmosphere inside Sandringham had shifted from quiet mourning into something far more tense, something procedural, something deliberate. Prince William, according to multiple royal insiders, had entered those meetings believing the situation would simply confirm what generations of royal inheritance tradition had already implied. Sandringham was deeply connected to the future sovereign. The private cottage, long viewed as one of Queen Elizabeth II's most personal sanctuaries, was expected to fall naturally under William's future oversight as Prince of Wales and eventual king. Reports suggest nobody anticipated complications. Nobody expected hidden directives, and certainly nobody imagined that sealed estate papers would suddenly place Prince George, not William, at the center of the Queen's final custodial plans. What began as confusion quickly evolved into visible discomfort. Sources close to estate personnel claim the tone inside those meetings reportedly changed the moment. Trustees presented additional legal documents connected to Elizabeth's final inheritance framework. These were not casual notes or symbolic gestures. Insiders whisper that the language was specific, carefully structured, and impossible to misinterpret. George's name allegedly appeared not as a ceremonial mention, but as the future custodian directly tied to the cottage itself. One senior figure reportedly described the revelation as a generational bypass wrapped inside constitutional caution. And within the context of a monarchy already navigating illness, instability, and succession anxiety, the implications became explosive almost overnight. The secrecy surrounding the matter only intensified suspicion. Palace aides were reportedly instructed to maintain what insiders called absolute discretion, an unusually severe phrase even by royal standards. Staff members allegedly avoided discussing the matter in open corridors. Phone conversations became shorter. Internal memoranda were restricted. And yet, despite every effort to contain the situation, whispers continued spreading beyond Sandringham's walls. Local personnel reportedly noticed heightened security around the cottage property itself. Estate schedules changed without explanation. Media correspondents monitoring royal movements began quietly comparing notes. Something significant was happening, and the palace's silence only deepened the mystery. Then came the moment that truly unsettled observers. Prince William was reportedly seen leaving Sandringham after one particularly lengthy consultation, looking visibly shaken. Those familiar with his normally controlled public demeanor described a man struggling to conceal frustration beneath duty. It was not anger alone. Reports suggest it was disbelief. The kind of disbelief that emerges when a deeply personal assumption suddenly collapses in front of legal reality. Catherine, meanwhile, allegedly moved quickly behind the scenes to calm growing speculation. Various interpretations of her private conversations suggest she understood the danger immediately. This was no longer simply about inheritance. It was about symbolism, hierarchy, and Queen Elizabeth II's final understanding of how the monarchy should survive the decades ahead. By evening, media whisper. Ers had already intensified across London. Royal commentators began referencing a possible legacy preservation strategy connected to the late Queen's final years. Some insiders quietly revisited stories about Elizabeth's increasing focus on Prince George during her final period at Balmoral and Sandringham. Others pointed toward broader concerns about continuity within the House of Windsor itself. Why now? Why structure such a sensitive arrangement in secret? Why bypass William publicly while still preparing George privately? Those questions lingered heavily over the estate as trustees continued their confidential discussions behind closed doors. But the true shock wasn't the cottage itself. It was the reason Elizabeth allegedly bypassed an entire generation to secure George's future directly. Long before it became the center of a royal inheritance storm, the secluded Sandringham Cottage was described by insiders as one of Queen Elizabeth II's most emotionally guarded sanctuaries. Hidden beyond the public eye, surrounded by ancient Norfolk woodland, it represented something far greater than real estate. And according to whispers now emerging from within palace administrative circle, Elizabeth spent years quietly deciding who she believed was truly worthy of protecting it after her death. For decades, the cottage existed almost like a secret chapter within the larger story of Sandringham itself. While grand estates, staterooms, and ceremonial residences attracted public fascination, this smaller retreat reportedly carried a very different purpose inside the royal family. It was never associated with spectacle or power. Instead, various interpretations from former household staff suggest it became one of the rare places where Queen Elizabeth II allowed herself distance from the exhausting machinery of monarchy. Those familiar with the rhythms of Sandringham life often describe the property as deeply personal to both Elizabeth and Prince Philip, a place connected not to duty, but to silence, to reflection, to moments untouched by cameras, protocol, and constitutional pressure. Reports suggest Prince Philip spent long stretches there during periods when royal life became especially overwhelming. Hunting weekends, private conversations, quiet walks through the Norfolk countryside. Those memories allegedly became emotionally embedded within the property itself. After Philip's passing, insiders whisper that the cottage took on an even heavier significance for the Queen. It was no longer simply a retreat. It became a living archive of memory. A sanctuary tied to the last fragments of a world Elizabeth feared was slowly disappearing around her. And according to several royal historians now revisiting her final years, that emotional weight may explain why she reportedly became increasingly protective over who would eventually inherit responsibility for it. The deeper trustees examined her estate planning. The clearer one pattern reportedly emerged. Elizabeth did not appear to view the cottage as a casual family asset to be passed down automatically through hierarchy. Instead, she allegedly framed it as something requiring preservation. Sources close to Sandringham administrative streams claim trustees were quietly instructed years earlier to maintain the estate for continuity, not convenience. That phrase alone has triggered enormous speculation across royal circles. Continuity of what exactly? Tradition? Values? Stability? Different interpretations continue to surface, but one unsettling possibility has gained particular traction among Ace insiders. That Elizabeth quietly worried future generations of the monarchy might surrender too much of the institution's sacred identity in pursuit of modernization. Prince William, according to those familiar with internal royal assumptions, reportedly never questioned that Sandringham responsibilities would eventually fall under his broader future oversight. It was considered natural, logical, almost inevitable. As Prince of Wales and future sovereign, William was expected to inherit not just property, but stewardship over the emotional geography of the monarchy itself. And for years, few believed otherwise. Yet behind closed doors, Elizabeth may have been thinking far further ahead than anyone realized. Because while William prepared for the immense burden of kingship, the Queen reportedly became increasingly fascinated by someone else entirely: Prince George. Insiders now claim George's childhood visits to Sandringham quietly became more important to Elizabeth than the public ever understood. Staff members allegedly noticed subtle changes in her behavior whenever George accompanied her around the estate. She reportedly paid close attention to his patience, curiosity, and emotional restraint. According to whispers from former household figures, Elizabeth seemed deeply interested in whether George possessed the same instinctive understanding of duty that had defined previous generations of the monarchy. Not publicly, not ceremoniously, but privately, carefully, almost as if she were studying him long before anyone else considered such questions relevant. Some royal commentators now believe those moments became part of a much larger succession philosophy developing quietly during Elizabeth's final years. Historians revisiting her later decisions have increasingly pointed toward a pattern of long-term institutional planning hidden beneath seemingly ordinary family arrangements. Reports suggest the Queen became deeply preoccupied with protecting the monarchy from instability after witnessing years of public scandals, internal fractures, and generational tensions. Within that context, George may not have represented simply a beloved great-grandson. He may have represented continuity untouched by conflict, a future still unshaped by palace warfare. And perhaps that is what now unsettles so many figures behind palace walls. Because if Elizabeth truly struck to, read this arrangement years in advance, then the decision was never impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, quietly strategic. And the more insiders revisit her final movements surrounding Sandringham, the more one uncomfortable realization continues to grow inside royal circles. The late Queen may have spent her final years preparing the monarchy for a future only she fully understood. But while the public saw a quiet inheritance arrangement, insiders claim a far more explosive family conflict had already begun behind palace walls. At first, Prince William reportedly believed the confusion surrounding the cottage was little more than administrative chaos following the Queen's passing. But as sealed estate papers continued surfacing before trustees, that confidence reportedly began to collapse. Because the deeper advisors looked into Elizabeth's final instructions, the clearer one devastating reality became. This was not a misunderstanding. It was intentional. And William had never been warned. The atmosphere inside Sandringham reportedly shifted almost overnight once the legal wording became impossible to dismiss. According to insiders familiar with the meetings, William initially approached the situation with calm skepticism, convinced there had been some clerical misunderstanding buried within the Queen's extensive estate arrangements. After all, royal inheritances often involved complicated structures, private trusts, and overlapping custodial language. But this felt different the moment additional documentation was quietly presented before trustees. Sources claim the wording inside those sealed directives was not vague or symbolic. It allegedly identified Prince George directly and repeatedly as the future steward connected to the cottage's long-term custodianship. That was the moment, insiders whisper, when confusion reportedly gave way to something far more personal. Shock. Reports suggest William immediately began questioning trustees behind closed doors, asking when the arrangement had been finalized and why Kensington Palace had never been informed beforehand. Those familiar with internal royal operations claim the future king was especially troubled by the timing. If Elizabeth had structured this years earlier, why had the matter remained hidden through so many family transitions? Through Philip's passing, Charles's accession, and even William's own elevation as Prince of Wales? Different interpretations of those tense conversations continue circulating across palace circles, but one detail appears repeatedly. William reportedly felt blindsided not simply by the decision itself, but by the silence surrounding it. The silence hurt almost as much as the inheritance structure. Legal advisors allegedly attempted to calm tensions by emphasizing that the arrangement carried symbolic significance rather than financial displacement. But according to various insiders, that explanation did little to ease the growing emotional strain. Because inside the monarchy, symbolism is never small. Symbolism becomes power. Symbolism becomes legitimacy. And the deeper palace figures examined Elizabeth's final instructions, the more unsettling questions emerged. Why would the Queen bypass the direct heir in favor of a future generation unless she believed something larger was at stake? That question reportedly began haunting conversations across royal households. Catherine, according to sources close to Kensington Palace, allegedly recognized the danger immediately. While speculation intensified outside palace walls, insiders claim she quietly regarding restraint during private discussions, warning that any visible reaction from William could trigger constitutional gossip capable of spiraling beyond control. The last thing the monarchy needed, especially during a period already overshadowed by illness and instability, was public speculation about fractures within the line of succession. Reports suggest Catherine became increasingly focused on protecting both William and George from the emotional consequences of the growing controversy. Yet even behind closed doors, maintaining calm reportedly became more difficult as tensions deepened between estate administrators and Kensington Palace aides. Those tensions, according to palace whispers, were no longer purely legal. They became philosophical. Some senior royals allegedly defended Elizabeth's decision as a deeply strategic act rooted in long-term institutional thinking. Others quietly questioned whether the arrangement reflected hidden anxieties the Queen may have developed during her final years regarding the monarchy's future direction. Had she feared modernization pressures would slowly erode the emotional foundations of royal tradition? Had she worried future sovereigns may become consumed by public image management rather than preservation of legacy? No one seemed willing to answer those questions openly, but the fact they were being whispered at all reportedly set unease through the palace. Meanwhile, William reportedly grew increasingly concerned about how the public might eventually interpret the inheritance arrangement if further details leaked. Royal commentators had already begun quietly discussing the possibility that the future king had effectively been skipped in one of Elizabeth's most personal legacy decisions. Even if the reality proved more nuanced, the symbolism alone threatened to create dangerous headlines. And inside a monarchy built as much on perception as reality, perception can become its own form of crisis. According to sources close to royal media operations, advisors were already monitoring growing speculation among correspondents attempting to connect the Sandringham decision to broader succession concerns surrounding the House of Windsor. What disturbed palace insiders most was that the controversy no longer appeared isolated to one cottage, one estate, or even one inheritance decision. The deeper conversations became. The more figures within royal circles reportedly started revisiting Elizabeth's final years through an entirely new lens. Her quiet meetings, her unusual secrecy, her increasing focus on George, her insistence on preserving certain traditions away from public attention. Suddenly, actions once dismissed as routine began appearing far more deliberate. And with every new revelation, one chilling possibility continued gaining momentum behind palace walls. Queen Elizabeth II may have spent her final years quietly preparing for a future crisis no one else fully saw coming. But the deeper investigators examined Elizabeth's final months, the more they uncovered a hidden strategy stretching far beyond one isolated property. What stunned palace insiders most was not simply that George's name appeared inside the inheritance structure. It was the growing realization that Queen Elizabeth II may have spent years quietly constructing an entirely separate line of royal continuity around him. Not publicly, not ceremoniously, but through trusts, private custodianship plans, and carefully protected estate arrangements hidden behind layers of legal discretion. As investigators and royal commentators continuing revisiting the Queen's final years, a striking pattern reportedly began emerging from within palace administrative records. According to whispers circulating among former advisors and estate officials, Elizabeth became increasingly preoccupied with what some insiders described as stability beyond transition. It was not simply about preparing for Charles's reign or even William's eventual accession. Reports suggest her concerns extended decades further into the future, toward the long-term survival of the institution itself. Those closest to the late Queen allegedly noticed a profound shift in her thinking after years of public scandals, family fractures, and escalating tensions surrounding the monarchy's modern identity. The more instability surrounded the House of Windsor, the more determined Elizabeth reportedly became to protect certain traditions from being diluted by uncertainty. That is where the situation surrounding George allegedly takes on a far deeper meaning. Trustees reviewing sealed correspondence reportedly discovered references not only to the cottage itself, but to broader custodial expectations quietly connected to George's future role inside the monarchy. Hi. Sources claim these documents were written with extraordinary precision. They did not describe George merely as an heir to sentimental property. Instead, they allegedly framed him as part of a longer continuity structure tied to preservation, discipline, and institutional permanence. Some royal historians now compare the arrangement to older dynastic safeguarding models once used within European monarchies, where specific estates, traditions, and private sanctuaries were quietly attached to future generations long before formal succession ever arrived. What makes the revelation so explosive is that insiders insist the arrangement was never intended as an insult toward William. In fact, several figures close to palace discussions reportedly argue the opposite. According to different interpretations now circulating across royal circles, Elizabeth may have viewed William's future role as already overwhelmingly burdened by constitutional responsibility, public pressure, and the demands of kingship. George, however, represented something different: untouched continuity. A future still protected from political exhaustion, from media warfare, from the compromises modern monarchy increased, as sincerely demanded. Within that framework, the Sandringham arrangement allegedly became less about favoritism and more about institutional protection stretching far beyond one generation. Even so, reports suggest William privately struggled with the emotional weight of the discovery. Those familiar with the future king's inner circle claim he attempted to maintain composure throughout increasingly tense trustee consultations, understanding the danger any visible family fracture could create for the monarchy. Yet insiders whisper that balancing personal shock against public duty became almost impossible as more details surfaced. Every new document reportedly deepened the sense that Elizabeth had been quietly planning something no one around her fully understood until after her death. And perhaps most painful of all was the realization that she had never openly explained it to him herself. Catherine, meanwhile, allegedly shifted into quiet protective mode behind palace walls. According to sources close to Kensington Palace operations, she became intensely focused on shielding George from the growing storm of speculation building across British media. Royal commentators had already begun framing the inheritance structure as evidence of hidden anxieties inside the monarchy. Catherine reportedly feared the public conversation could eventually place unbearable emotional pressure on George, before he was even old enough to fully understand why his name had become central to such a sensitive controversy. While William navigated constitutional implications, Catherine allegedly concentrated on preserving normalcy for their children amid escalating palace tension. At Sandringham itself, staff members reportedly began revisiting older instructions that suddenly appeared far more significant in hindsight. Insiders claim certain traditions connected to George had quietly been preserved for years without broader explanation. Specific routines during private visits, particular rooms maintained with unusual care. Small ceremonial habits Elizabeth reportedly insisted remain unchanged whenever George stayed on the estate. At the time, many dismissed these gestures as simple affection from a great-grandmother toward her future heir. But now, palace figures are allegedly questioning whether those moments formed part of a much larger blueprint quietly unfolding beneath the surface all along. Some insiders have gone even further, interpreting Elizabeth's strategy as an attempt to future-proof the monarchy against instability she feared could emerge long after her death. The Queen had witnessed constitutional crises, public rebellions against royal privilege, media scandals, generational conflict, and shifting public trust. Perhaps according to palace whispers, she concluded that preserving the emotional foundations of monarchy required thinking beyond immediate succession altogether. If so, the Sandringham arrangement was never merely about inheritance. It was about survival. Quiet, calculated survival designed to protect the institution from storms Elizabeth believed were still coming. But just as William tried to contain the growing storm, another revelation reportedly emerged, one that transformed private discomfort into open royal anxiety. The situation might have remained buried inside confidential trustee chambers if not for one devastating leak. Within hours, the effects of the medication were observed. Royal correspondents across London began receiving identical whispers about a special custodial designation tied to George and the Sandringham estate. Suddenly, What had been a private inheritance? Necessity exploded into a constitutional spectacle, forcing the palace into silence just as public curiosity reached fever pitch. At first, the reports surfaced quietly, almost cautiously, buried beneath broader royal coverage, and framed as little more than speculative chatter from anonymous palace circles. But the speed with which identical details began appearing across multiple media networks reportedly alarmed senior royal aides immediately. According to insiders familiar with palace communications, journalists from several major outlets had suddenly started asking unusually precise questions about trustee meetings, estate correspondence, and sealed inheritance structures connected specifically to George. That level of detail terrified officials behind the scenes, because it suggested the leak had not come from ordinary gossip. Someone with direct knowledge of the discussions had spoken. And once that realization spread through royal administrative offices, panic reportedly followed close behind. Media outlets across London allegedly began launching quiet investigations into the Sandringham inheritance structure itself. Reporters who normally focused on ceremonial appearances, ninth public engagements were now digging into trust frameworks, estate custodianship, and historical succession patterns tied to private royal properties. Palace aides reportedly hoped the story would lose momentum within hours. Instead, the silence coming from official channels only intensified public fascination. The palace refused direct comment. No denial. No clarification. No attempt to dismiss the reports outright. And inside the monarchy, silence often speaks louder than confirmation. That silence, according to sources close to Kensington Palace, reportedly infuriated Prince William. Insiders whisper that the future king became increasingly frustrated not only by the leak itself, but by the terrifying realization that deeply confidential estate discussions were no longer contained within secure royal channels. Every new headline reportedly deepened concerns that additional details surrounding Elizabeth's private planning could emerge next. And according to several palace figures, there were far more sensitive documents still hidden behind trustee confidentiality than the public currently understood. The Sandringham Cottage had become only the visible surface of something much larger. Estate insiders allegedly feared the situation could spiral into a broader unraveling of Queen Elizabeth II's final succession philosophy. Reports suggest some trustees quietly worried that if journalists uncovered additional correspondence tied to George's future role, the monarchy could face an unprecedented wave of speculation surrounding hidden dynastic planning. Because by now, the debate had moved far beyond one inheritance dispute. Public discussion increasingly centered on a far more explosive question. Had Elizabeth intentionally reshaped the future royal hierarchy before her death? That question ignited fierce debate among royal commentators, constitutional observers, and former palace staff. Some dismissed the speculation as exaggerated media hysteria. Others, however, pointed toward the Queen's long history of cautious strategic planning. Royal historians began revisiting her final years with growing intensity, arguing that Elizabeth had always approached monarchy not as a temporary reign, but as a centuries-long institution requiring protection across generations. According to several commentators, the Sandringham arrangement appeared consistent with a monarch, deeply obsessed with continuity, discipline, and institutional survival above personal sentiment. And within that interpretation, George allegedly represented not favoritism but preservation. Yet while experts debated constitutional meaning, one figure remained trapped at the emotional center of the storm: Prince George himself. Despite every effort to shield him, George reportedly became the unexpected focal point of national fascination almost overnight. Newspapers speculated endlessly about his future role. Television commentators dissected Elizabeth's intentions. Online discussions exploded with theories about succession, symbolism, and hidden palace strategy. Sources close to Catherine claimed the Princess of Wales became increasingly protective as the pressure escalated. Determined to prevent George from absorbing the emotional weight of a controversy he was far too young to fully understand. Behind palace walls, insiders whisper she focused relentlessly on preserving stability for her children, while the institution around them drifted deeper into uncertainty. Meanwhile, the monarchy itself appeared increasingly trapped between secrecy and exposure. Every attempt to contain the controversy only seemed to generate fresh speculation. Every refusal to comment fueled another cycle of questions. And beneath the carefully controlled public silence, fear reportedly spread among senior royal figures that the leak had permanently changed the internal balance surrounding Elizabeth's final legacy. Because once the public began questioning whether the late Queen had quietly engineered a new continuity structure around George, there was no simple way to force that conversation back into the shadows. The deeper reporters investigated, the more they uncovered hints of a monarch who may have spent her final years preparing for instability she believed was still approaching the House of Windsor. A weakened king, a future sovereign under immense pressure, a younger generation carrying the burden of preserving an institution increasingly vulnerable to division. Suddenly, Elizabeth's quiet decisions no longer appeared isolated or sentimental. They began looking strategic, almost defensive. And for Prince William, that growing perception reportedly created an unbearable dilemma between protecting his grandmother's legacy and confronting the painful possibility that she had ever fully trusted the future to unfold on its own. But behind the palace's carefully controlled silence, William was reportedly preparing for one final private confrontation with the trustees themselves. By the time Prince William returned to Sandringham for the final closed-door briefing, insiders say the atmosphere had turned icy. The trustees reportedly arrived carrying sealed archival documents, private correspondence, and instructions connected directly to Queen Elizabeth II's final estate directives. What followed, according to whispers now circulating through royal circles, left the future king sitting in stunned silence as the full scale of Elizabeth's long game finally became impossible to ignore. According to sources familiar with the meeting, the tone inside the room reportedly shifted almost immediately once the final documents were placed before William. There was no confusion anymore. No room left for speculation or procedural misunderstanding. Trustees allegedly explained in direct and unmistakable terms that Elizabeth's decision regarding the Sandringham Cottage had been deeply deliberate and quietly structured years earlier, long before public concerns about royalty and instability ever intensified. The arrangement, insiders claim, was not drafted during the emotional chaos following Philip's passing or during Charles's illness. It had reportedly existed in protected form for years, carefully shielded behind layers of legal discretion, while the Queen observed the changing future of the monarchy around her. What reportedly affected William most was the realization that the arrangement had never truly been about ownership in the traditional sense. Estate advisors allegedly clarified that George's designation carried symbolic continuity rather than financial significance. The cottage itself, according to various interpretations shared during the meeting, represented something Elizabeth believed transcended ordinary inheritance. It was tied to memory, to stability, to the preservation of emotional identity inside a monarchy increasingly consumed by modern pressure and public turbulence. Reports suggest trustees emphasized repeatedly that the Queen viewed Sandringham not simply as royal land, but as part of the spiritual continuity of the crown itself. And within that vision, George allegedly represented a future connection untouched by exhaustion, scandal, or institutional compromise. For several moments, insiders whisper that William reportedly said very little. Those familiar with the atmosphere inside the meeting claim the future king appeared caught between personal emotion and constitutional understanding. Because the deeper the trustees explained Elizabeth's reasoning, the harder it became to interpret the arrangement as a rejection. Instead, it increasingly resembled a carefully constructed message from a monarch who had spent 70 years studying the fragility of royal survival. Some advisors allegedly described the Queen's final strategy as an attempt to preserve emotional anchors for future generations of the crown long after current conflicts faded away. And according to palace figures, that explanation slowly began changing William's perspective. Catherine, who insiders claim remained quietly involved throughout the unfolding crisis, reportedly encouraged William to focus not on personal disappointment, but on the larger meaning behind Elizabeth's decision. Sources close to Kensington Palace suggest she increasingly viewed the arrangement through the lens of legacy rather than hierarchy. The monarchy, after all, had survived for centuries precisely because certain figures were willing to think beyond themselves, beyond pride, beyond immediate power. And according to whispers now circulating within royal circles, Catherine may have privately believed Elizabeth was attempting to give George something far more important than property. She was giving him responsibility before he was old enough to even recognize its weight. As the meeting continued, George's role reportedly became framed less as an inheritance recipient and more as part of what insiders now describe as Elizabeth's enduring royal blueprint. Trustees allegedly referenced the Queen's repeated concern about protecting continuity during periods of transition. The monarchy was entering uncertain territory. A weakened king, generational division, growing public scrutiny, and a rapidly changing national identity. Within that unstable landscape, Elizabeth reportedly sought fixed points capable of surviving political storms and personal conflict alike. Sandringham, in her view, may have represented one of those fixed points. And George, still untouched by the bitterness consuming older generations, became quietly positioned within that vision. Palace insiders now claim William ultimately accepted the arrangement, though not without visible emotional strain. Reports suggest he left the final briefing understanding something that had once seemed impossible to comprehend. Elizabeth had not been planning only for the next reign. She had been planning for the monarchy's emotional survival decades into the future. That realization reportedly transformed the atmosphere surrounding the entire controversy. What once looked like a painful inheritance dispute now appeared part of a much larger constitutional philosophy hidden carefully behind the Queen's silence. And perhaps that is the detail now haunting so many figures inside the House of Windsor. Even after her death, Queen Elizabeth II continues shaping the institution through decisions nobody fully understood while she was alive. The Sandringham arrangement did not simply expose hidden estate plans. It revealed the extraordinary extent to which the late Queen may have quietly engineered continuity, far beyond public visibility. And as palace insiders continue revisiting her final years, one unsettling conclusion appears impossible to ignore. Elizabeth may have trusted time itself more than any living figure surrounding her in the present. And as the gates of Sandringham closed once again, one chilling reality lingered over the House of Windsor. Even in death, Queen Elizabeth II may still be shaping the monarchy's future more powerfully than anyone ever realized. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.